In 1940, Wilder's literary agent, George By, wrote Wilder to tell her that he had sat up until 2 o'clock in the morning reading the manuscript for The Long Winter, and then had trouble going to sleep for thinking of the plight of the Ingalls family and that awful winter. The book was published later in 1940 to critical acclaim. For sheer gallantry, the story can't be beat. It puts iron into the imagination. And full disclosure here, The Long Winter is the book I most admire in the series for its artistry, structure, and power, that imaginative iron. I didn't always feel this way about The Long Winter. When I first read it as a 9 or 10-year-old, I assumed Wilder's descriptions of blizzards were exaggerated, in the same way my family exaggerated Ozark stories about tornadoes, copperhead snakes, and those giant catfish that inevitably got away. I mean, who could believe this? They could barely walk in the beating, whirling wind. The schoolhouse had disappeared. They could see nothing but swirling whiteness and snow, and then a glimpse of each other disappearing like shadows. Sure, we had blizzards in the Ozarks of my childhood, but I didn't quite believe that Laura could see nothing but swirling whiteness and snow. And then, when I was in my 20s, I moved to South Dakota and experienced my first prairie blizzard. It stretched over 2 days. I was warm and safe in my apartment, but a driver stranded on the interstate between Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and Sioux City, Iowa, had panicked and left his car. His frozen body was found not far away after that cold and swirling whiteness had relented. My respect for Wilder as a realistic writer about the natural world skyrocketed. The Long Winter wasn't hyperbole. It wasn't adventure fantasy. It was indeed historical fiction, as we'll see. And as I began to write fiction myself, I also realized that The Long Winter had an almost flawless structure. The story follows a perfect arc. More about this later. But for Wilder, The Long Winter proved to be an extremely challenging imaginative process, as she wrote George By. It has been rather trying, living it all over again as I did in the writing of it, and I am glad it is finished. But it wasn't just the memories that made the writing of The Long Winter difficult for Wilder. It was the storyline itself. It is rather a dark picture, not so much sweetness and light as the other books she wrote her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane. In fact, the working title for the book was The Hard Winter. Both Wilder and Lane thought of the manuscript this way. So, how to shape an essentially depressing and harrowing experience into a novel for young adults, and how to develop a plot that would keep readers turning the page through one dark and dreary blizzard after another. Wilder struggled to find her way through the story, and in a moment of creative frustration, she wrote Lane, "Here is what is bothering me and holding me up. I can't seem to find a plot, or a pattern as you call it. There seems to be nothing to it, only struggle to live through the winter until spring comes again. This is, of course, all they did. But is it strong enough? Or can it be made strong enough to supply the necessary thread running through the book?" Wilder went on in the letter to outline various plot possibilities, but came back to the same issue, unsatisfied with her own preliminary ideas. But where is the plot in Hard Winter? Lane offered several ideas, including a plot point that came directly from Pioneer Girl. The real Ingalls family hadn't spent the hard winter alone in Charles Ingalls' building in town. They had shared it with a young couple whose families had essentially banished them to Dakota Territory when she became pregnant. Lane's suggestion prompted Wilder to explain the circumstances more fully. George Masters was a clerk on the railroad work west of town. When we moved to town, he wanted Maggie to come west and board with us, so she would be near him until the work stopped when they could go east. When Maggie came, Ma saw she would soon have a baby much too soon after the time she was married. Maggie didn't want the baby to be born at her folks's and disgrace them. George's folks were mad because he married her and wouldn't have her there. Maggie had always been a nice girl, and Ma was sorry for her and let her stay. The baby was born before winter came. Work stopped, and George came. We thought they were leaving, but George put it off. The winter set in and caught them. There was nowhere else they could stay. Every house was full, and Pa couldn't put them out in the street. Lane recognized that there was inherent drama in the situation that could enliven the plot of The Hard Winter. In fact, Caroline Ingalls herself, along with Mrs. Garland, Cap's mother, had delivered the master's baby in the Ingalls storefront home. But Wilder disagreed. Although she had to admit the presence of the master's family could add tension and conflict to the fictional family's experiences during the hard winter. George paid Maggie's board while he was working. Afterward, he paid nothing. He never went with Pa for a load of hay. He never twisted any. He just sat. He would have done differently, or I'd have thrown him out. But Pa wouldn't. Sweet charity. But for Wilder, this kind of conflict wasn't essential to the plot of The Hard Winter. But Lane persisted. If not the Masters, then perhaps the fictional family could invite the Boasts to join them for The Hard Winter. Still, Wilder disagreed. We can't have anyone living with us, she argued. If she substituted the Boasts for the Masters, Wilder noted, the point of the situation would be blunted. Given the Boasts' generous characters, Mr. Boast would help haul hay, and he would help twist it. He would help grind wheat. Mrs. Boast would leave the baby in a chair by the fire and help. Wilder opted once again for a more mythic situation and a basic plot line for the fictional Ingalls family in the book. It would spoil the story to add the Masters or the Boasts to The Hard Winter. The Ingalls family must be alone. Still, at least initially, Wilder did accept one of Lane's suggestions. I am beginning Hard Winter as you suggested, with the strangeness of the geese not stopping at the lake. Ultimately, however, Wilder modified even this idea. In the final draft of the novel, Pa indeed notices the unusual patterns of migratory birds that fall. He tells the family, "Something's queer. Not a goose nor a duck on the lake, none in the slough, not one in sight. They are flying high above the clouds, flying fast. I could hear them calling. Caroline, every kind of bird is going south as fast and as high as it can fly. All of them going south." But this isn't the opening scene in the book. This scene takes place toward the end of chapter 2. Instead, the final draft of the novel begins with a different and more compelling opening, one that is consistent with Wilder's original observation about how people lived through the hard winter, simply waiting out the seasons. And yet, what appears to be a simple solution, the passage of time and the turning of the seasons, gives the long winter a mythic and indeed almost perfect story arc. The novel begins in a hayfield on a hot summer day. Who could imagine the cold to follow, and that the hay Laura and Pa were cutting would save their lives? But also in this opening chapter, Wilder provides the first hint of conflict when Laura finds a muskrat house in the big slough. Pa was shaking his head. "We're going to have a hard winter," he said, not liking the prospect. "How do you know?" Laura asked in surprise. "The colder the winter will be, the thicker the muskrats build the walls of their houses," Pa told her. "I never saw a heavier built muskrat's house than this one." Wilder then builds one conflict on top of the next. ratcheting up the tension and conflict, and in the process creating a flawless plot. A rare October blizzard, a warning from a wise American Indian, more about this later, a sudden blizzard that strikes while the children are at school and their struggle to get home safely, a cluster of blizzards that blocks the trains, dwindling supplies of food and fuel, the threat of starvation or freezing to death. Notice that the biggest threat in the novel comes, as it should, toward the end of the book. The Ingalls could, quite literally, lose their own lives. Then finally, the novel resolves itself with quick falling action in the last two chapters, waiting for the train to arrive and celebrating Christmas in April. Listen to Wilder's last lines. And as they sang, the fear and suffering of the long winter seemed to rise like a dark cloud and float away on the music. Spring had come. The sun was shining and warm, the winds were soft, and the green grass was growing. The Ingalls family has gone from light into ever-deepening darkness and emerged on the other side, the end of the long winter, into springtime and light. A perfect story arc, a perfect plot. Despite her objections, Wilder did, of course, introduce important new characters in The Long Winter, and they added to the richness of the plot, as well as providing new insights into Laura's character. She's going on 14 when the novel opens, and as most young adults at this age, is aware of the opposite sex. Then suddenly, Laura saw one of the boys spring into the air and catch the ball. He was tall and quick, and he moved as beautifully as a cat. His yellow hair was sun-bleached, almost white, and his eyes shone blue. They saw Laura and opened wide. Then a flashing grin lighted up his whole face, and he threw the ball to her. Without thinking, Laura leaps to catch it, and Cap looks around at the other boys in the schoolyard and says, "She's as good as any of us." Instantly, there's a bond between them, and Cap behaves heroically throughout the rest of the novel. The real Cap Garland, Oscar Edmund Garland, was just 2 years older than Wilder. He was 15 in the autumn of 1880 when she first met him. In Pioneer Girl, Wilder wrote that she always noticed Cap during church services and wished he would take her for a ride in his cutter. His fictional counterpart goes on to become an important secondary character throughout the rest of the series. And another confession. When I first read The Long Winter as a kid, I assumed Cap would become Laura's beau, perhaps because I hadn't yet read Farmer Boy. Which brings me to, of course, Almanzo Wilder, who emerges as an important character in this book and the remaining 2 books in the series. Of course, readers of the entire series up to this point had become reacquainted with Almanzo in By the Shores of Silver Lake, where he makes a brief yet dramatic appearance with his beautiful team of Morgans. The horses catch Laura's eye. They drew a light wagon. A young man stood up in the wagon, driving, and a taller man stood behind him with a hand on his shoulders. Pa identifies the pair as the Wilder boys. Almanzo's driving, and that's his brother Royal with him. They've taken up claims north of town, and they've got the finest horses in the whole country. By George, you seldom see a team like that. Pa admires the horses, and by extension, the men driving them, making Almanzo and Royal even more worthy of Laura's attention.